Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. Hello, and welcome to the Ident Review Extra, the spin-off show that takes a look at one individual ident each episode and gives it the review it deserves. And this time around, we're embarking on a journey through the rhythm and movement idents that represented BBC One between 2002 and 2006. To kick things off, we'll be taking a look at perhaps the most recognisable sequence of the set, Capoeira. As the world was still getting used to the new millennium, the time would soon arrive that the UK's oldest channel, BBC One, would be gearing up for an identity rebrand. The then current balloons had been flying across the country's screen since 1997, but the latest set was lining up to be the most radically different and controversial idents for the channel yet. The globe motif, which had been the channel's key identifier since the 1960s, was finally set to be done away with. For the new set, dubbed the Rhythm and Movement idents, would have more of a focus on people and the various activities that they could engage in. So let's begin with the very first ident that was used to introduce the set, Capoeira. I'm sure that brought back a few memories for a lot of you. Capoeira was first seen on the 29th of March 2002. This was the first day in which the rhythm and movement idents would be seen, taking over from the balloons after nearly 5 years. Initially, there was some outcry from audiences regarding the absence of the globe. Whilst the balloons had focused more on the landscape seen around the UK, the globe had still featured, albeit in a smaller, more subtle way. Over time though, audiences would become accustomed to the new sequences, Capoeira in particular. The notion of watching others perform activities is a concept that would later be used in the 2010s in the Oneness set, but I think the Rhythm and Movement bunch, noting Capoeira in particular, pull off the concept in a better way.
Welcome to Good Friday morning and our brand new look on BBC One.
We see two artists engaging in Capoeira, which is a Brazilian art form that combines elements of martial arts, dance, acrobatics, music and spirituality. Quite a melting pot of concepts there. It's quite a graceful and elegant thing to engage with, and as a viewer, part of that elegance carries across. The music chosen instantly adds to the visuals, creating a very calm tone that gears you up perfectly. Capoeira was often seen introducing the lunchtime news on weekdays, so the regular airings helped it become one of the more recognisable sequences in the entire Rhythm and Movement set.
Arsenal defender Ashley Cole looks forward to tomorrow's top-of-the-table Premiership clash with Chelsea in 10 minutes. That's in Football Focus on BBC One. After the news now with Matthew Amreliwala.
Whether you loved or hated the new look at the time back in 2002, Capoeira, I believe, is the perfect way to introduce this concept to BBC One. It's not too loud or brash, instead taking things slow, using an interesting art form combined with appealing music to bring audiences into this new style of ident. After nearly 40 years of seeing a rotating globe of some kind, it was always going to take time for long-standing viewers to adjust, but thanks to sequences like Capoeira, it would result in some of the most recognisable idents for the BBC in the early part of the 21st century. Shortly after the Rhythm and Movement idents debuted on the 29th of March 2002, audiences were keen to see the numerous different variations that this new concept would bring about. Most sequences tried to carry across an upbeat tone, with some of them filled with energy and vibrancy. However, ready to meet all occasions, BBC One would also have idents ready to reflect the more somber times that the UK would go through during the early 2000s. So with that, let's head over to the Cornish coastline to take a look at Ballet. Somber, yes, but also really beautiful. The first thing I want to draw attention to is the location. The ident was filmed at the Minack Theatre in Cornwall, a stunning venue that sits right against the coastline. I've never been myself, but it's a venue I'd love to visit someday. When performing shows outside, exposed to all the elements nature has to offer, anything can happen, which only adds to the thrill of it all if you ask me. In the ident we see 10 ballerinas all dressed in bright red, performing a routine against the beautiful landscape. Not only is the ballet graceful to watch, but the musical accompaniment fits the piece perfectly. It's not overly bombastic, it's more relaxed yet filled with emotion. Fitting really, as ballet, or a still of it anyway, would be seen quite early on in the set's life, to mark what many deemed as a national tragedy.
Now on BBC One, a special BBC News with Peter Sissons.
The Queen Mother has died peacefully at the age of 101. The announcement from Buckingham Palace said the Queen was at her bedside.
One day after BBC One's new look debuted, on the 30th of March 2002, the Queen Mother passed away at the age of 101. Whenever a member of the royal family passes in the UK, everything grinds to a halt, whether you like it or not. I'm not a royalist, but I always sense the feeling of impact that an event like this can have on the nation. And even though it's just a still, it seems apt that ballet, out of all the rhythm and movement idents, be the one to mark this occasion. The sequence would seldom be seen on BBC One over the next 4 years, only really being used to mark moments of reflection. Examples of this included various funerals, such as those of footballer George Best and former Pope John Paul II. However, despite its relative scarcity amongst its peers, ballet would represent the whole rhythm and movement brand as it bid its last farewell. After 4.5 years representing BBC One, the rhythm and movement idents would bow out in the early hours of the 7th of October 2006. Just before the new circles were due to take over, a final montage of several sequences of the set was played. And what better way to close out that montage than to play ballet in full? Seeing these ballerinas perform their routine against the somber music for the last time is honestly moving in some respect. Whether you loved or hated the rhythm and movement set, for some audiences at least, particularly those of us who grew up in the early 2000s, this set was our introduction to BBC One and possibly terrestrial television as a whole. Ballet would become one of the most memorable and recognisable idents from the set, and I think over 20 years later, it holds up tremendously for its beauty, its simplicity, and the emotions it had the potential to conjure up. And for some viewers, it remains their favourite ident not just in this particular set, but for BBC One as a whole. So far on our journey, we've looked at the debut ident, Capoeira, and the more sombre reflections of ballet. But there were a couple more sequences that were introduced to the public on launch day. Keen to showcase the variety of activities seen in these new idents, and to further help people adjust to a globalist sequence, we'll observe one of these attempts, simply known as Acrobat. Now, that's the kind of physical strength I aspire to have. We observe 3 acrobats performing a routine, filmed inside of the Royal Horticultural Society halls in London. Colour scheme-wise, similar to ballet, red is the dominant colour. Fitting really, as this was the era in which the BBC really wanted to assign a different colour to its rapidly expanding roster of channels. So BBC 2 would take on purple, or yellow for the actual background, BBC 4 would be black, the upcoming BBC 3 would be a pale shade of blue, and for the flagship channel, BBC 1, red was chosen, a colour that the channel would be represented by for well over a decade. The beauty in this, and several idents in this set, is the artistry. To witness these acrobats move around utilising the aerial silks, the sheer body strength needed, it's very impressive and very engaging to watch.
This is E4.
Acrobat would often be seen before the news, its more lively soundtrack perhaps alerting audiences that their attention is required. If I could make any small nitpick, it would perhaps lie in the camera shots. The setup is a simple pull back and zoom out in order to fully see all 3 artists perform, but I think this could have gone one step further. After zooming out, why not begin to pan around the space, witness this performance from a variety of different angles? I truly think there would have been a way to do it without the sequence coming across as disorientating. But one aspect I cannot fault is the artists themselves. The three acrobats shown from left to right are Jane Osborne, Melissa Merrin, and Michelle Lane. Their choreographer was Roger Robinson of the renowned Acrobat Productions, and he himself helped develop the concept of the ident. Whilst we're on the designers, it's important to note that the entire rhythm and movement concept and idea was developed by design firm Lambinerne. We're no strangers to Lambinnerne's work here, and Martyn Lambinerne, despite being no longer with us, is still regarded as one of the most innovative and important ident designers of all time. And whilst the rhythm and movement set isn't viewed amongst the firm's best work, it seems that over the passage of time, more and more audiences have come to appreciate these sequences. Acrobat may not be the first ident you think of when it comes to this set, and indeed, it arguably isn't the most memorable. However, when you go back to watch it, it's almost impossible to not admire the sheer artistry being exhibited by these three acrobats. And I'm happy to say that it won't be the last time we see a group of individuals exhibit their talents in this way. We've already established from the first few idents of the rhythm and movement set that the BBC clearly wanted to focus on real people embracing and showcasing their talents and their interests. Athleticism and elegance have been the key elements we've noticed so far, and I'm happy to say that in both of those, that'll continue with this next sequence. It goes by several different names, but the one I've most commonly seen used to refer to it is hip-hop. Once you've heard that beat, that's not going to leave your head. We see the stage is set on a basketball court, which is fitting, as basketball is one of the many different names that this particular sequence goes by, showcasing some of the different moves that can be seen in the sport. It all blends together really well, if you ask me. The movements are nice and slick with the background beat, and it's visually appealing to watch from the start. I'd be foolish not to mention the hip-hop tune itself. It's very sanitized, very BBC version of hip-hop. And what I mean by that is, whilst the beat itself is strong, it lacks a lot of the oomph and hard edge that occupies some of the very best of hip-hop. But this was the early 2000s, and hip-hop itself was exploring a more relaxed vibe to some of its more mainstream sounds. But if anything, this is a catchy earworm if I ever heard one. One of the most recognisable soundtracks of the rhythm and movement set for sure.
Here on BBC One now, size matters for Lynn and Esther.
One key factor I want to chat about is the colour scheme. Red we've established is going to be the dominant colour across the entire set, and once again it's been used to great effect here. Whether it's the outfits of the players, or the wheels on their chairs, or even part of the court itself, its striking nature hasn't faded at all. Also, let's talk about the lead player in this sequence, renowned Paralympian Adi Adepitan. Not only was Adi a great inspiration in the athletics field, but to many, including myself, he was well known as being a television presenter. At that time, he was one of the people that fronted Exchange, a children's programme that mixed a game show format with factual entertainment. It ran from 2000 to 2006, and with over 2,000 episodes across its life, it's one of the most well-remembered from this time period of children's telly. Whilst Adi continues to inspire today, let's not forget that for 4 years, he appeared on viewer screens almost every day, showcasing that just because you may face physical adversities, that doesn't mean you can't achieve something great. Hip-hop, or basketball, or wheelchairs, or whatever you know it by, continues to be one of the rhythm and movement idents that is most remembered 20 years on. For a set that was heavily criticised on its debut, I think idents like hip-hop absolutely champion the idea of showcasing people doing what they love or what they do best, and that absolutely applies to everyone, able-bodied or otherwise. And whether you like that beat in the background or admire the skill of these athletes doing their thing, it leaves a sequence that, whilst relatively simple in nature, comes across as uplifting and inspiring. To that effect, I'd argue that hip-hop remains one of the greatest triumphs of not just the rhythm and movement set, but for BBC One's idents as a whole. When people think back to the rhythm and movement idents, they think of the more slow-paced, serene sequences. Idents that are memorable in their own way, not needing to be loud or brash in their presentation. However, it is important to remember that this set did have idents that did exactly that. And today, we'll be diving into one of the most recognisable. So with that, let's head on down to the festival. Okay, so this one is interesting to analyse. The concept itself, of people dancing, isn't exactly new or groundbreaking. Variations have been seen on several different channels over the years, so we're not exactly innovating here. But where this ident supremely works, and for what it's most often remembered for, is for that sweet, sweet beat. BBC One was going for a semi-recurring musical motif during this era, arranged in different styles depending on the ident. This dance remix version perfectly encapsulates the kind of beats that were popular in the mainstream in the early 2000s. Dance music in particular was consistently evolving and enduring massive success, particularly at the clubs. Now, this is a festival, which makes me think a club setting would have been better to fit the music, but that's a minor nitpick. The music is fantastic, and even after 20 years, it's still great to hear. If only they'd expanded it into a full song and released it as a single. More on that later.
Here we go. Just one little point stands in our way. Gary Lineker introduces Match of the Day live now on BBC One. Come on, England.
However, despite my gushing over the soundtrack, for me, that's about the only element of the ident that truly works. Visually, all you have to witness is a huge crowd of people jumping up and down. Seriously, that's it. The camera pulls back so we can see just how many people are here, and the space used was quite large as this was filmed at RAF Bovington. Wonder what the active soldiers on duty thought of all this. Whilst the scope is impressive, people jumping up and down on a slowly widening camera shot loses its appeal quite quickly. Perhaps had we seen multiple angles, a look at what they were bopping to, focusing on different people, just anything, quite frankly. I honestly think why festival, or rave, as some know it by, has endured so well in people's minds, is due to how memorable the music was. Because really, you can't tell me you remember this ident for the visuals alone, right? The music is king, and it wouldn't just appear in this sequence.
Fun with the little people meet the borrowers in half an hour on BBC One.
1 year after its debut in 2002, State One would take the jingle and incorporate it into one of their own tracks, Forever and a Day, which was released in 2003. Now, from what I understand, this tune didn't make it into the mainstream charts. However, like most dance-centric songs, it would find its way into clubs and gain a sort of cult popularity status. The sampling of the festival jingle is handled really well, blending seamlessly into the rest of the song. And when you hear it go off after listening to the build, like most good dance tracks, it's actually quite euphoric. Go and give it a listen if you're interested. Ultimately, whilst Festival did arguably give us the best sounding ident of the rhythm and movement set, I think overall in terms of its presentation, it just missed the mark. I get wanting to keep things simple and very self-explanatory, but I feel that could have been maintained easily with a few adjustments. Had this sequence not had the killer track behind it to back it up tremendously, I would be amazed if anyone could recall Festival or even hold it in their memory. As after 20 years, it stands as an example of whilst an ident can sound fantastic, it also has to have the visuals to truly make it a standout. The art of dance is a constant through the rhythm and movement set of idents. Already we've seen ballet dancers showcase their talents, and even the bouncing ravers exhibit a form of dancing in Festival. But today, we'll be taking a look at another dance-based sequence, one that utilises one of the most well-known and popular techniques out there. So without further ado, let's put on our dancing shoes and take the floor to the salsa. Very classy indeed. Now, just to get this out there right off the bat, I'm no dancer. I can act and sing, but when it comes to dancing, it's always remained my weakest performing skill. However, I can always appreciate good dancing, particularly when done in groups. Witnessing these various couples smoothly perform the salsa is a joy to watch, perfectly punctuated by the soundtrack. That recurring riff heard in a few of the rhythm and movement idents is heard again if you listen out for it, stylized to a more salsa-friendly beat. I have vague memories of this, so it could be false, but I seem to remember this sequence being used to introduce a programme that at the time was in its early years, but would go on to become the BBC's biggest Saturday night show, Strictly Come Dancing. But when you watch this sequence, doesn't that just make so much sense?
For better or for worse for wear, Dudley Moore's The Millionaire Who Needs a Wife. Arthur, the late film, here in half an hour. First on BBC One, comedy connections to butterflies.
In terms of filming, the location is Sarrett in Hertfordshire, in a rather gorgeously designed room. Aside from the appealing location, it incorporates the main red colour in a distinct yet subtle way, and one element I also love about the Salsa ident is the different kinds of people we see performing the dance. The BBC should always be trying to showcase and represent all kinds of people in the UK, and whilst it continues to try and deliver that remit, it's nice to see that even 20 years ago in 2002, when diversity wasn't as well championed, we see so many different kinds of people in the sequence. It would have been nice perhaps if the camera had focused on each couple individually, rather than pan out to show a group, just so everyone would get a chance in the spotlight. But in terms of what we have, seeing different kinds of people as opposed to just a singular couple is a strong plus in my eyes. Like many of its peers, Salsa would continue to air sporadically on BBC One until late 2006, when the rhythm and movement idents were replaced entirely. I'd argue that it remains an ident that isn't often talked about from this set, as like many of them, on the surface it seems incredibly simple without much to delve into. But from the great soundtrack to the smooth technique of the couples dancing, to the variety of people, there's just more here than you'd first think. An underrated ident in what continues to be an underrated set. Sports have been a key part of BBC One's lineup since the black and white days of television. Whether you love it or hate it, there's always a huge demand from viewers to be able to watch their favourite sport on the TV, should they not be able to go to a game in person. Rugby is undoubtedly one of the biggest sports we enjoy here in the UK, so when it came time to create idents around the concept of rhythm and movement, the game of rugby has one element that would, in theory, fit perfectly with this remit. So let's take a look at the Haka.
Rivalries don't come much bigger than this. Now on BBC One, Gary Lineker introduces uninterrupted action from the match of the day, live.
Cracking stuff. For those unfamiliar, the Haka originates from Maori culture, being a traditional dance for the indigenous Polynesian people of New Zealand. It utilises your hands, feet, legs, body, voice, and even your tongue and your eyes. If you ever catch New Zealand playing rugby, the All Blacks will perform the dance before every game. Fitting then that where we start camera-wise is on a Maori native, Joe Hutley. He leads the dance while surrounded by several amateur Welsh rugby players, who join him in the Haka. The dance itself I've always found really fascinating to watch. The intensity of the movements and sounds comes across as something truly quite powerful, and that's no exception here. However, this ident isn't without its faults.
Tom Cruise to the rescue now on BBC One Wales, and Mission Impossible includes strobing effects in the opening title sequence.
When it comes to TV idents, I've always been a big believer of synergy between audio and visual, that you can have the greatest looking or most interesting concept for your sequence going, but if the soundtrack used doesn't back it up, then it arguably doesn't reach its full potential. To me, that's exactly what happened here with Haka. Given that the dance itself is so loud and complex and intricate, known to audiences for building up to the start of a rugby game, it's a surprise to hear that the soundtrack doesn't match that. Instead, we get a string arrangement, one which does use the recurring theme heard across the rhythm and movement idents, and in fact sounds more like an upbeat version of the ballet sequence. And as nice as it may sound, I'd argue that it just doesn't fit at all with the Haka concept. I feel the music needed to be louder, more bombastic, more fitting for how general audiences often see the Haka to be performed. You could argue the idyllic Welsh setting warrants a more serene soundscape, but I disagree.
A collection of pottery and ceramics that's just too big. It's gotta go. Cash in the Attic hopes to sell it on for a bob or two in 25 minutes. After Neighbours.
Haka was seen amongst the launch batch in March of 2002 and was sporadically seen over the next few years, appropriately utilised to introduce sport-based programming. However, Haka has the distinction of being one of only 2 idents from the rhythm and movement set to be removed from broadcast circulation before the set's retirement as a whole. This happened sometime around 2005, and was reportedly down to issues with music licensing. Rather than remove the ident entirely, I would have seen this all the more reason to produce a new score, one that arguably better reflects the Haka and how it's presented. Sadly, when a final montage of rhythm and movement idents was shown in late 2006, Haka was not present among them. 20 years since its debut, Haka remains one of the sequences from this set that rarely gets spoken about, aside from it being removed from the airwaves. Whilst I think the central concept is a striking one that is a great showcase for other cultures on TV, the lack of appropriate music just totally ruins the potential for me. Some will like it as is, which is totally fine of course, but I've always viewed Haka as one of the greatest missed opportunities of the rhythm and movement set, one that with a few tweaks here or there, could have become one of the most recognisable and most popular. Regarding different styles of dance, we've experienced several varieties in the rhythm and movement set so far, including ballet and salsa, but one avenue of dance that I personally love is tap. Tap dancing is an art that, when performed with the right skill, accuracy and attention to detail, can create a piece that's truly stunning to watch or even perform. With that gushing praise for the art form, let's settle back and watch the Tap Dogs. One of my absolute favourites, no lie. We see a troupe of dancers tap around an industrial-based location, their feet perfectly tapping in time with the music, which for those eagle-eared listeners will recognise that familiar refrain heard throughout this set as a whole. Where do I even begin with this beauty? The obvious main positive has got to be the dancing itself. These guys are professionals, and the way they move not just with their feet, but their bodies in tandem as well, with all the actions that come from it, is just stellar to watch. The red clothing they wear continues the emphasis on the colour red for BBC One, and the artistry extends up from the floor. Towards the end, you can see some of the dancers ascend several ladders, and then begin to tap on them. To do that precisely, whilst being up at a height, now that can take some skill. The location in which the Tap Dogs are performing as mentioned works perfectly. The location itself is actually Littlebrook Power Station in Dartford, Kent. Now, I'm no architect, but I've often found these huge industrial complexes such as power stations to be absolutely fascinating in their intricate design. How these guys utilise and interact with their surroundings, the ladders and so on, really emphasises the tap dancing for which they excel at. I wish more idents generally did something like this, focusing on people interacting with seemingly ordinary or mundane surroundings in a fun and unique way. Tap Dogs would be seen often, but I remember seeing it the most on Saturday nights, before a certain sci-fi show, which itself had been back after a very long break.
Well, now BBC One hurtles through space and time. Come with us for the trip of a lifetime. Aliens, you have been warned. Christopher Eccleston is the new Doctor Who.
That's right, folks. On the night of Doctor Who's return on the 26th of March 2005, the ident to lead us directly into the episode titled Rose was presented to us by the Tap Dogs. And to be honest, when thinking about the rest of the rhythm and movement idents, I think using this one to bring back Doctor Who is a great choice. Others could have done it for sure, but I think this one just builds that excitement, gets your interest, and lets you know that no matter what the programme, you should be in for a good time. Having been a mainstay on BBC One for 4 years, the Tap Dogs showcased their last dance on the 7th of October 2006, when they featured as part of a montage looking back at all the different sequences that embodied rhythm and movement. As previously mentioned, Tap Dogs has always been one of my favourites, certainly when I was a kid. And as an adult, it remains an absolute belter of an ident. The sheer energy that the performers exude whilst dancing, the excellent location choice, the way the environment is used is just brilliant. Definitely one of the best dance-based idents we've seen on TV over the last 20 years. Ever since the birth of stations like MTV in the early 1980s, music videos have formed an integral part of being a performer within the mainstream music industry. From early groundbreakers to the short films that occupy new songs today, despite perhaps not being as impactful nowadays, everyone has at least one music video that they know and love. And with that, let's delve into BBC One's attempt that first appeared on TV screens in late 2002.
Romance is in the air tonight as Minty finally makes his move on Emma. EastEnders, just half an hour away, here on BBC One.
Have you ever seen a more 2000s thing in your life? Music video was the first ident in the rhythm and movement set that didn't debut on launch day. Instead, it would debut just over 6 months later, on the 4th of October 2002. If you thought red was incorporated subtly in other sequences, it's full on here. We see 7 dancers strut their stuff against a predominantly red backdrop, which does look great with a bit of extra movement, which was a common occurrence in music videos of the era. To further discuss the look of the ident, the outfits the dancers are wearing, as well as the moves they're making, would absolutely feel right at home of the most popular artists of the day, including performers such as Britney Spears. The choreography is smooth but also feels very coordinated and precise, which again was seen by a lot of popular singers and groups. If you could mimic the dance steps, then that was often the sign of a good music video. Whilst I dig the whole aesthetic and admire the BBC actually being able to capture the vibes of the day visually, I do have my issues with the music itself. It does incorporate the recurring refrain of this era, which is a nice touch, but it's now presented in this electronic sounding mix, but it just sounds so strained and tinny. This sort of minimalistic sound did have its place in the mainstream during the early 2000s, with sparser beats being backed up by some insane lyrical bars. But given that this is just an instrumental, I think to truly enhance and complement the choreography, I feel the sound should have been a lot bigger, fuller, and perhaps embrace the more bombastic sounding pop tunes that were storming the charts. It's not a bad beat, but I just feel it's missing its oomph. It doesn't pack a punch, whereas the dancers do. So again, it doesn't quite meet my belief in synergy. The visuals are great, stunning in fact, some of the best of the set, but the audio that accompanies it doesn't quite hit the same note for me. As mentioned, music video was the first rhythm and movement ident to debut after launch day, but this new ident was partly inspired and designed for a very specific program that was to debut on viewers' screens. If you don't know which program I'm talking about, if you were around in the early 2000s, you're about to get a flooding of memories. That's right, music video was the sequence that led directly into Fame Academy. Inspired by the performing school from the 1980 film of the same name, this new program was a bit of a hit in its day, particularly those of us who avidly tuned in week after week to watch it. So, if music video is remembered for just one thing, why not for the early 2000s genius of Fame Academy? It's great to see that music video wasn't only a limited edition ident commissioned for a specific program, but one that would become part of the main lineup. Like the rest of the set, it would last be seen in the early hours of the 7th of October 2006 via a tribute-style montage. Over the years, music video I feel has gotten much more appreciation and discussion attributed to it. Whilst the concept is simple, I think the strong visual look, one which shares so many similarities with short films of the day, really helped it feel like a relatable sequence to those watching. This could have easily been part of a pop star's video, and I'd be so keen to see the BBC try something like this again sometime. Music videos have changed radically over the past 20 years, but even if a new attempt was made, you can never forget the original. Prior to the 2000s, most BBC idents mainly comprised of showcasing the symbol of the channel, with a bit of this and that around it. My point being that real people were never really a feature. The closest we came was with the balloon idents of 1997, and whilst real life locations were shown across the UK, real people remained absent. And with the rhythm and movement set placing real people at the heart and centre of it all, it's been great to see different kinds of people and cultures be represented. And that trend continues today, as we look at Bollywood. Another nostalgia trip for me here. As the name would suggest, this ident embodies some of the key elements seen in the division of Indian cinema known as Bollywood. For those who don't know, India produces the most feature films in the world, with Bollywood being one of its most productive and lucrative when it comes to the box office. Whilst films of this category come in all shapes and sizes, the incorporation of music and dance is a mainstay in many of these films. As such, we see 9 male and 9 female dancers moving together in the centre in perfect harmony. One key element I like though is that the familiar red of the set is contrasted well with the bright white of the men's outfits. Seeing both colours move and blend together is really nice, and with these dancers being experts in their crafts, it makes the whole thing all the more appealing. More dancers join the fray as the camera pulls out, revealing the landscape in which this ident is set. I'll touch more on that in just a second.
An intimate performance from one of the world's biggest music stars tomorrow night on BBC One, Elton John in session at 10:35.
Bollywood was first seen on TV screens in November of 2002, so quite some time after the rhythm and movement idents debuted. I can't find any information indicating that it was to promote a specific program, but similar to Tap Dogs, I remember seeing Bollywood quite frequently on Saturdays, often before what would become the Beeb's biggest show of the weekend, Strictly Come Dancing. With dance being such a key element of the ident set, Bollywood felt and still feels like a natural fit amongst the bunch, giving Indian culture the chance to take centre stage and in spectacular fashion. The music thankfully matches the visuals, with the soundscape sounding very akin to what you'd hear in a Bollywood film, particularly during the musical numbers. However, despite all the praise I've heaped on so far, I do have one main criticism to share. As the camera pulls back, we can see that the set that's been put up again reflects a location that you'd see within India itself, with a red backdrop taking up most of the screen space. Whilst honouring the Indian culture is appreciated, I don't see why an ident like this couldn't have actually been filmed in India. Now, I have no idea what the budgets were for things like this, but given that the BBC has various teams stationed around the world, I'd like to think that even in 2002, it wouldn't have been impossible for a small crew to film some dancers amongst an iconic Indian landmark at the very least. I know red is the main colour for the set, but to me, that big backdrop we see by the end is just a bit of overkill. Despite my issues with the set, the main element, the dancing, works superbly. Like the other dance-based sequences we've looked at so far, the precision and passion of the dancers bursts through the screen, and really makes the whole ident feel that much more appealing and watchable. Indian culture, including Bollywood, is very fascinating to delve into, and it makes me wish that each ident from Rhythm and Movement could have focused on a different culture from different countries. But as it stands, Bollywood remains a nice window into one of India's biggest successes in the entertainment industry. If you've been following the sequences in this ident set so far, you'll know that dance is such a key component of what makes this set work. What better way to exemplify rhythm and movement than via the medium of dance? Ballet, salsa, or the slick choreography of a music video are just a few examples that we've viewed so far. But now we head back to the ballroom to take a look at another favourite technique amongst the Strictly crowd, the tango.
Join Boise and Marlene down on the farm with the green grass at 8:30.
Very eloquent indeed. The setting for this ident is Leadenhall Market, located in the city of London. Here we see a trio of couples take to the streets to dance a tango, supposedly under the element of pouring rain. Right from the get-go, we can see the common themes of this ident set carry on over to this sequence as well, namely the predominance of red in the colour scheme and the incorporation of the recurring musical motif. Although admittedly this time it's a lot more subtle, more suited to a tango absolutely, but perhaps not as obvious to the ear as some of the other variants. But outside of this visual and audio constant, the major factor to always look at with an ident like this is the dancing itself. The trio of couples we see dance execute the moves superbly, just as the other artists did in their respective idents. I can't see as much variety in the people themselves compared to a sequence like Salsa, but ultimately, if they had filled these streets with couples, combined with the scenery, it may have felt a little bit overcrowded. I like that the camera showcases all three, but in a similar critique to some of the other dance idents, I wish the camera would move around the different couples individually, focusing on how each of them expresses themselves differently. The tango, as with most dance techniques, has familiar moves, but they can be showcased in a whole number of ways, and being able to view each one individually would have been great, but as it stands, darting your eyes between the three of them isn't too disorientating. Tango first debuted in the first few days of 2003, gradually expanding the lineup of the Rhythm and Movement set as a whole. Like many of its peers, it wasn't tied to introducing one specific program, but like with several other dance idents, it was an easy pick to usher in a show such as Strictly Come Dancing. I remember seeing it on Saturdays, whether that was before Doctor Who, Casualty, or some other program on the weekend lineup. It was able to last all the way up until the Circle idents took over in October of 2006, but in the near 20 years since its debut, is it well remembered? With so many dance-based idents to arise from this era, it's understandable that some of them could get lost in the memories of viewers. From who I've talked to, People remember this one quite well, alongside other sequences like Tap Dogs for example. For me, it's not my favourite of the dance idents seen on BBC One at this time, but it certainly isn't a failure. If anything, it lives up to the remit of the concept, to display ordinary people exhibiting rhythm and movement in a whole variety of different styles. The rhythm and movement set of idents is stacked with variety, with skills such as dance taking a big presence. However, martial arts has also played a part in the set, including the very first sequence to debut in this era, Capoeira. And now we have another interesting martial art to delve into, one which has its core principles in self-defense, as well as meditation. So with that, let's have a look at Tai-Chi. Wondrously peaceful, wouldn't you say? We see a group of Tai Chi practitioners going over their craft in an idyllic setting. The setting in question is actually located in Scotland, near Loch Rannoch. Scotland has some beautiful natural locations, so choosing one such as this to showcase an art form that has such a strong basis in meditation is a perfect fit. The group are led here by Ian Cameron, himself an Edinburgh-based instructor, with the variant of Tai Chi being based in the traditional Wudang system, originating from China. It truly is an interesting martial art to witness, and when set in such a location, it really makes for a soothing and comforting ident.
They're on BBC One now, they tell it like it is.
In regards to how Tai Chi fits in with the rhythm and movement set as a whole, it holds many of the similarities of its peers. For example, the musical riff of this era is heard, but presented in a more oriental style, meeting the calm reflective nature of the visuals that we see. Red once again is front and centre colour-wise, predominantly in the practitioners' uniforms. Now, Tai Chi was first seen in the June of 2003, however it remains one of the few rhythm and movement idents to actually get a second variant. So let's have a quick look at that one. Such a small change, but I really like this. This variant starts out the same, before the camera perspective is flipped around, so that we, the audience, are actually viewing them practice via the reflection in the lake. It truly looks beautiful to see this perspective showcased, further boosted by the great setting and soundtrack. I actually think I prefer this version ever so slightly more than the original, which is a great shame in a way, as the second variant of Tai Chi was only on screens for a matter of months before it was withdrawn from the airwaves. There isn't much information available as to why this was the case, but the first variant is the sequence that got the most airplay, lasting all the way up until the changing of BBC One's idents in late 2006. The legacy of the Tai Chi ident may be based in how its second variant was a rarity for the time and for its brevity on the airwaves, but I think it should gain much more credit than it gets. Tai Chi was often played right before news broadcasts, which is fitting really. The news can so often be filled with hard-hitting or somber stories from around the world, and having an ident like this which is calm, soothing, relaxing, and even occupies a more meditational feeling, just like the art form it's showcasing. It's in some ways the perfect way to ease people into a news broadcast. It may not get much discussion these days compared to some of its peers from the era, but for me, Tai Chi remains one of the most underrated BBC idents of the early 2000s. The BBC's always had a daunting task of trying to appeal and meet the needs of all kinds of people, across all ages or races and so on. It doesn't always hit the mark, but the rhythm and movement idents I've always felt were a good attempt at getting some variety into BBC One's identity. We've seen a whole host of people showcase different skills and activities, and that trend continues in today's feature, where on a shipyard, we'll observe the talents of the skateboarders. Rather more serene than I was expecting. I think anyone could be forgiven for thinking that this ident would be a lot more action-packed, loud and bombastic, but I really enjoyed the fact that it subverts that expectation. Instead, we see a trio of skateboarders gracefully gliding through a shipyard, expertly demonstrating their skills, and trust me, I've tried skateboarding and it can be difficult to master. The location itself is the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and what a great location it turned out to be. Similar to Tap Dogs, we get a chance to see these guys manipulate the environment to their advantage. A shipyard may not be the first place you think of when it comes to skateboarding, but when you see these three perform their tricks with such fluidity and ease, it becomes a no-brainer.
So, which Maria should be tied up with string? Keep voting for who you want to save, and Ronan Keating joins Graham with the results show at 9:25 here on BBC One.
The three skateboarders in question are actually professionals within the field, that being Ollie Todd, Franklin Stevens, and Danny Wainwright. I remember when growing up in this era that skateboarding was sort of going through a cultural boom once again during the early 2000s, and seeing sequences like this on the telly, I'm sure, would have inspired people of all ages to give it a try for themselves. It was first seen in the September of 2003, releasing as another new addition to the rhythm and movement lineup. One element that really complements the more laid-back tone is the music. It's a soothing piano arrangement of the now familiar jingle we keep hearing in the set, and it blends so well with the visuals that it remains one of my favourites of the entire batch. And given that it contained a calming, slightly somber soundtrack, you'd often end up catching Skateboarders before news broadcasts, as well as at the end of the CBBC strand when it was still broadcast as part of BBC One. Given that this ident was filmed in Northern Ireland, it's unsurprising that throughout its lifetime, it received a ton of airplay within that region. It also had a special alteration made for it for a couple of broadcasts in 2005. Unfortunately, we don't have any footage, but I can describe it as best I can. After defeating England 1-0 in a qualifying match for the 2006 World Cup, the BBC One Northern Ireland logo was changed from red to green. A new square appeared in the opposite corner, displaying an English flag, and the word displayed within it was nil. Nice way to celebrate your victory, if you ask me. Upon the retirement of the rhythm and movement set in late 2006, in the Northern Ireland region, Skateboarders was the last ident to be showcased, thanks once again to the fact that the location of the sequence was shot in Belfast. Fitting in a way, and fascinating to see how one particular ident within a big set could form such a special bond with one of the 4 regions of the UK. Skateboarders to me represents every element that works in the rhythm and movement set. It has some stunning visuals, not just in terms of location, but in terms of the people displayed. The skateboarders are effortless in their execution, and combined with the gorgeously simple music, creates one of the greatest audio-visual blends of the early 2000s, in terms of TV idents. Skateboarding has popped up briefly in BBC One since, including in their latest lens backstrap sequences, but for me and many others, it will always be the 2003 original that showcased the best demonstration of the sport. And who knows, maybe one day it will return, or be expanded upon, to create something even greater. As the 21st century arrived, the world was beginning to feel more accessible to the everyday person. Maybe not necessarily in the physical sense, but certainly in terms of online. The internet allowed the world to be looked at in a new way, with millions discovering new places and people via the World Wide Web. However, traditional television continued to deliver on that remit as well, particularly with the BBC. The rhythm and movement idents already have showcased a willingness to display people of all kinds and cultures, and that is exemplified by our ident today. So let's have a look at Massai. Really fascinating stuff. The Massai are a tribe located in parts of Kenya and Tanzania, with a population of roughly 2 million. One of the most standout features for which they are known for are for their unique customs and dress, which is brimming with detail if you use an eagle eye. Appropriately, this ident features native Massai members on location in the African savannah, another opportunity for BBC One to showcase not just the UK, but different parts of the world. I could definitely see this being used as part of the BBC World Service, a vital component of the corporation, particularly for English speakers living abroad.
Now, BBC One's up for a glorious afternoon live at Wimbledon with Super.
Massai was introduced halfway through the lifespan of the rhythm and movement idents, first debuting on the 5th of January 2004. It was the only new ident for the set that year, and would remain the sole ident of this particular era to be filmed outside of the UK. As mentioned in the Bollywood instalment, it's a shame that more international filming wasn't able to occur, as a truly world-based perspective reflected in idents is a tantalising concept indeed. Like say if Bollywood had been filmed in India, or Haka filmed in New Zealand, that could have been fantastic. But I'm glad that even though it's the only one, Massai got the chance not only to show off a different culture to millions, but it was able to do so amongst the African landscape.
Disturbing the past and unleashing the ancient forces of evil now on BBC One, Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz have woken the mummy.
Unlike some of its peers, Massai doesn't get much of a mention when discussing the rhythm and movement idents. Perhaps it was down to appearing halfway through the set's life, or by some viewing it as uninteresting. But even though we see the Massai people here jump up and down, there is more to dissect. The music is a percussion-based version of the jingle used by BBC One, and gels really well in my view with the visuals and the setting. It may not have a great deal going on compared to some other sequences, but in my view it achieves the remit of both the set and the BBC as a whole, to provide a service at home, but also abroad, to introduce audiences to concepts they aren't familiar with, to show them different lifestyles and cultures, and hopefully, they'll learn something. I highly recommend you read more about the Massai tribe. I mean, you can really fall down a rabbit hole with how much there is to know about them. It may not be the most remembered, but I feel it slots in nicely with the vibe and feel that the rhythm and movement ident sets out to create. The rhythm and movement idents were unusual for 21st century television, in that they didn't have many special variants in their set tied to specific events or programs. There are some, and we'll get to those, but in terms of the main sequences, after the initial launch in 2002, the addition of new idents happens at a slow pace. In 2005, the last regularly seen sequence would be added to the lineup, so let's witness the flexibility of the Tumblers. If I'm honest, I've got mixed feelings on this one. To start with the positives, the display of athleticism from these guys is incredible. Watching them flip and fly around this setting is great, and is very reminiscent to me of what we saw with the skateboarders over in Northern Ireland. The camera is constantly moving, which creates a good sense of motion and flow, and the colour red remains present to keep a sense of familiarity with the set at large. It was also filmed at Pebble Mill Studios, once a key hub for the Beeb, though it has since been demolished. However, I do have some criticism of Tumbler, the key one I want to address being the music.
An Oscar winner for BBC One Northern Ireland tomorrow night, and one of Francis Ford Coppola's very best. Gene Hackman stars in The Conversation at 12:05. Into the midnight hour now with violence, sex and strong language. Tom Berenger's the detective, falling for a witness to murder.
The soundtrack we hear incorporates the familiar BBC One jingle of the era, mainly using a sort of synthesised brass to keep it all together. Whilst on a base level it fits with the visuals that we see, the music, to me at least, sounds rather abrasive and a bit unfeeling in terms of how harsh it is. It's not unlistenable by any stretch, but let me put it this way, there are far better soundtracks from this ident set alone that could have been used in place of this. It may come as no surprise then that when this ident first hit the airwaves in early 2005, a completely different soundscape was heard entirely. Now, doesn't that sound a whole lot better? This more urban hip-hop sounding beat was the initial soundtrack for Tumbler, and was indeed heard on the ident's first broadcast. However, due to a copyright dispute regarding the track, After just 24 hours, Tumbler was given a new piece of music, which is what we heard earlier. I understand that replacing it was unavoidable, but the funkier, edgier soundings of the original fit so much better than the brass sounds of the replacement, at least to my ears. It's all subjective. Oddly though, the original music was heard for the remainder of the Rhythm and Movement set's life, though only if you were watching BBC One Scotland. As idents go, I enjoy Tumbler in the same way I enjoy several sequences from this set. It demonstrates people showing off their talents and skills in a very appealing and exciting way, though I feel compared to something like Skateboarders or even Tap Dogs, it's just missing that little bit of extra that makes it magic. The revamped soundtrack definitely hinders this one for me, and having debuted in 2005, it barely got much time to cement itself amongst its peers, many of which had first been introduced back in 2002. So whilst it may not be my favourite, I'm sure there's some of you who adore it, and if there's one thing we can't dispute, it's the tumbling itself. Another great rhythmical showcase of what this ident set was all about. The BBC has had a long tradition of adapting or inventing brand new special idents to mark the Christmas period. Ever since the late 60s, their flagship channel, BBC One, always had a unique sequence every year, most of which have gone on to become well known and regarded in their own right. When the Rhythm and Movement idents became the channel's representative identity in 2002, it was only natural that the Christmas tradition would continue. But it wasn't without its controversies. So let's sit by the fire with a warm brew and have a look at Snowflakes, the ident that represented BBC One, celebrating Christmas in 2002 and 2003. Well, isn't this wholesome? We see a series of children dressed as snowflakes fall from the sky to a snow-laden earth before running about against a red sky. A nice touch, as we firmly established red is the dominant colour. By coincidence or by design, it also happens to be one of the main colours associated with Christmas. It stands out for sure, but when contrasted with the snowy landscape that these kids are in, it feels less jolly and a bit more doom-laden. The music though helps to alleviate this feeling, comprised of an upbeat series of jingles and sounds that are present in many a Christmas tune. In terms of using the children to front an ident, some may criticise it, but I think it fits with the ethos of the Rhythm and Movement set. They may not be showcasing a specific skill, but the joy in their movement fits perfectly for Christmas, and it shows that BBC One is comfortable with showing all kinds of people, whether they be children or grown-ups.
BBC One turning up the heat. George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez just can't fight their attraction, with violence and very strong language. Out of sight.
In terms of the long history of Christmas sequences that BBC One has had over the years, it isn't one of my all-time favourites, and for many, it bears a sour taste, as in 2003, it caused some minor, perhaps overblown controversy. As mentioned, BBC One would showcase a brand new ident every Christmas, and it had been that way for decades. However, after initially being used for the Christmas season of 2002, Snowflakes was reused a year later, in 2003, the first time that this had happened on the Beeb's flagship channel. Some members of the public complained to the corporation, because if the British are sticklers for anything, it's tradition, and the tradition of a new ident at Christmas had been shattered. Of course, nowadays it's not so much of an issue, as idents of all kinds are reused constantly across different channels, but for a short time in 2003, these snowflake-looking children were not in the hearts of every viewer.
Parkinson at Christmas is tonight at 10:15. Now, back to ancient Egypt for a magical adventure. It could be a bit scary for younger kids, so get ready to hide behind the sofa as BBC One unleashes The Mummy.
Being that Snowflakes was the first Christmas ident of the Rhythm and Movement set, in many ways it feels like it was trying to work itself out. Keep in mind that the set as a whole was seen as a radical departure for BBC One at the time, and with more emphasis on people as opposed to a globe or a similar symbol. As such, it may not be the best Christmas ident the corporation has ever created, but like anything, it had to start somewhere. The real test, especially after the hoo-ha caused by reusing it in 2003, would be to see if an eventual new ident for Christmas could restore that goodwill. We've established that the Rhythm and Movement idents got off to a rather rocky start when it came to Christmas. The Snowflakes were cute, but it wasn't one of the all-time greats, and given that it was the first festive ident that BBC One reused the following year, it's never sat too well with those who take an interest in these things. So for 2004, a new ident was commissioned, so let's see if it could win back the favour of certain members of the public as we tuck in to some Christmas pudding. Similar, yet an improvement in my eyes. Before we go through this in depth, it's important to note how this ident came to be. The concept and design actually was born from a competition run on popular children's magazine programme Blue Peter. The presenters tasked their viewers with the chance to design the festive ident, the winning selection being the one that would represent BBC One for the 2004 Christmas season. And it seems that inspiration was drawn from the first festive sequence from the Rhythm and Movement set. Children are the stars once again, though rather than dressed up as snowflakes, they're dressed in more generic Christmassy attire, bouncing around on Christmas puddings as if they're space hoppers. And to be honest, that's a pretty good idea.
So first on BBC One, it's a fight for survival as the staff of Casualty and Holby come together in the aftermath of the Boxing Day hospital disaster.
Another improvement I like with the 2004 variant is the set design. We're still amidst a predominantly snowy white landscape, which remains an appropriate choice of course, but the main point I'm glad they altered was the sky. In the 2002-3 sequence, the red tone of the sky made it look a lot more like an apocalypse as opposed to Christmas. Whereas this time, it's been softened somewhat, making it look more like a calming winter sky heading into the sunset, which definitely generates the warm fuzzy feeling of Christmas. Also, the red of the kids' outfits is more than enough to continue the colour theme of the ident set as a whole, and the contrasting green and brown tones of the pudding further help make this one of the most visually appealing idents of the Rhythm and Movement set.
It's going to be a blue Christmas.
The music to this one remains very similar to what we heard the previous year. Something upbeat, jolly, and very, very Christmassy. I'm a bit more lenient on soundtracks for Christmas idents, because wanting to generate a festive feeling is understandable, but it's nice to hear something a bit different every once in a while. Overall, I hope whoever won that Blue Peter competition is proud of their winning design. For me, it marks a major step up from the Snowflakes, but also retains a sense of continuity, establishing that for the Rhythm and Movement idents, the people that would be showcased for Christmas time would be children. Their joy at the festive season is clear for all to see, making them the ideal candidates for these idents. Now on an upward trajectory, there would only be one further Christmas ident during the lifespan of this particular set, and all eyes were on whether it would continue a unique trend of festive sequences, or whether the Christmas puddings, like the Snowflakes before them, would be brought back out once again. Having only lasted on the airwaves for little over 4 years, it's easy to forget that the Rhythm and Movement set only gave us 3 unique Christmas idents during its lifetime. The first one was a first step, for sure, albeit not perfect, and the second one was designed by a young viewer, established some continuity whilst also retaining the fun and joyful elements of the season. Well, when it came to Christmas of 2005, all the stops were put out for this one, with some very interesting comparisons. With that, let's see the setup of the Christmas tree. This feels very familiar. Before we get to a very obvious comparison, let's talk about the ident itself. Once again, the stars of the sequence are a group of children, carrying baubles up a swirling ramp to hang on the grandiose Christmas tree, which acts, quite fittingly, as the centrepiece. Their outfits this time aren't snowflakes, but they sort of look like Pikmin, in a way? I'm sure that wasn't the intention, but they look odd nonetheless. We've fully abandoned a red-shaded sky this time, in favour of a variety of greens, which in my view looks a lot more appealing and better communicates the Christmassy vibe. Whilst we're on colours, I absolutely adore the selection we have on display here. Not only do we have the green sky and the expected red in both the costumes and the baubles, but we also have yellow and pink and of course the white of snow, which adorns the landscapes for a 4th year running, with Christmas trees visible in the background. It's definitely the most appealing visual for me out of the festive idents of the era, but I think it's time we discuss what this reminds me so strongly of.
More frightening than Pauline Fowler, it's the celebrity mastermind Black Chair, and Sonia, actress Natalie Cassidy, takes the lonely walk to it in an hour. First on BBC One, Michael Aspel welcomes a new generation of collectors.
In the summer of 2005, a remake of the 1971 classic, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, was released to cinemas, now named after the original book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Starring Johnny Depp as the famed chocolate maker, it received mixed reviews. Some criticised director Tim Burton's vision as being too abstract and bizarre, whereas others believed it was more faithful to the book than the Gene Wilder version. Nevertheless, the remake had a very distinct visual style, as well as a standout soundtrack, and when looking at the Christmas ident in terms of both audio and visuals, it feels very similar. The never-ending swirls on the baubles are present throughout the Chocolate Factory, and the music itself, whilst also including the BBC One jingle, sounds less Christmassy and more mysterious and ever so slightly eerie. Now, it's not known whether the designers took direct inspiration from the Tim Burton film, but considering both were first seen within months of each other, it seems like an incredible coincidence.
It's the furthest the show has ever travelled, but will the experts find what they're looking for down under? The Antiques Roadshow in Australia in half an hour, here on BBC One.
As mentioned, Christmas Tree would be the last festive ident seen in the rhythm and movement era, as 1 year later, the Circle idents had fully taken over the duties of representing BBC One. And honestly, I stand by my view that this is the best of the three idents that the set had to offer at Christmas. Not only does it have the best colour palette, I admire how musically it shrugs off the familiar festive jingles in favour of something a bit more ethereal and whimsical. It may not connect with everyone, but I think it's great. If anything, after a few attempts, it seems the designers had finally found their footing when it came to Christmas idents in the rhythm and movement era. It's such a shame we weren't to get any more, but as a final roll of the dice, I think Christmas Tree shines at the head of the pack, as not just the best festive ident of the era for BBC One, but one of the best sequences in the set as a whole. Throughout our journey so far, I've showcased to you all of the main sequences that comprise rhythm and movement during its short lifespan. However, there were relatively few special idents aside from the festive favourites that appeared during the 4 years of this era for BBC One. We've seen special Christmas idents, of course, but you could have always assumed they were a given, since they'd been a long-standing tradition for decades. However, there are two variants that only were shown in the region of Wales. Being a half Welshie myself, I'm excited to get into these. So let's begin with our first one, which I'll unofficially title Victory.
A change to the schedule now on BBC One Wales. Match of the Day will be shown at midnight and again tomorrow morning at 8:10. But now we're celebrating Wales' historic Grand Slam victory by re-showing the whole of this afternoon's game. Uninterrupted, it's Wales versus Ireland at the Millennium Stadium. Savour the next 90 minutes.
Ah, fan revelry. There's nothing quite like it. As you can see, a group of Wales fans are gathered together in a public place, most likely a pub. We don't get to see what they're watching, but it must be good news as they jump about and celebrate together, all to the soundtrack of the festival ident, which as previously mentioned, is one of my absolute favourites. Seeing people celebrate something they're passionate about is always appealing in my view, but as you've probably guessed from the continuity announcer, this is marking one very special event indeed. The 2005 Six Nations Championship saw Wales come out victorious, winning all 5 of their games, giving them their first Grand Slam title since 1978, ending a 27-year gap. Given their unprecedented performance throughout the championship and their stunning victory against Ireland in the final, BBC One Wales decided that not only would this special ident be broadcast, but an alteration be made to the station's logo. If you look in the bottom left corner, you'll see the familiar red BBC One box. However, the one has been cleverly changed to 1, marking the historic victory for the Welsh. The victory ident was shown on the same day the team were crowned the winners, on the 19th of March 2005. The final game was repeated, and still remains one of the proudest moments of Welsh sport in recent memory. It's great to see as well that it's not just men in the picture, but women are here too, showcasing as many of the rhythm and movement idents do, that sport can be and should be for everyone. But amazingly, this wasn't the only ident to mark the special occasion. A second variant appeared also. This one I'll simply title Flag.
If you saw the drama Kidnapped recently here on BBC One Wales, there's a special programme about its author, The Adventures of Robert Louis Stevenson in 40 minutes, after Songs of Praise.
Best flag in the UK, always has been. Set inside a sports stadium, we see two figures slowly descend to the ground, carrying with them and unfurling the Welsh flag, showcasing its green, white, and of course the magnificent red dragon. It's simple, yet graceful, and when set against the music originally heard in Skateboarders, I think it paints quite the serene picture indeed. Not much information is known about this one, and the continuity announcer seldom mentions football at all, rather that Songs of Praise is about to start instead. That programme tends to go out on Sundays, and given that the final game of the 2005 Six Nations was on Saturday the 19th of March, I would assume that this sequence was seen in the early hours of Sunday the 20th of March. Given that the BBC One text box still proclaims BBC One Wales and the focus on the Welsh flag, the sense of national pride would still be at its peak the day after. The two Wales variants in the rhythm and movement era are a rare event indeed. At a time where special idents weren't being produced as regularly on BBC One, for the Welsh to get two of them, not even to mark a specific programme, but more of a national achievement, is something truly worthy of being proud of. Whilst I love seeing the fans' jubilation, I think the flag is a great sequence all its own. It makes you feel a sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment, and if you're Welsh, a great sense of where you come from and being proud of it. And at the time of writing, as Wales gear up to head to their first World Cup in over 60 years, we can hope that whatever fueled them to win these Six Nations back in 2005 will continue to fuel them now in 2022. The BBC has always been able to poke a little fun at itself throughout the last 100 years, and with its idents, it's always been open to allowing a little humour grace the airwaves from time to time. Whether it's a more jokey turn from a continuity announcer, or the idents themselves being manipulated in some way, parody idents are always a fascinating subgenre in themselves. During the rhythm and movement era, several parodies would crop up, some made by the BBC, and some by other channels or entities entirely. Just a heads up, many of the clips I'm going to present today I'll have to showcase in a chopped up form, otherwise copyright claims will prevent this episode from being seen at all. So apologies if this seems a bit messy, but I hope the gist of the sequences can still come across. With that, let's start with three idents that pay a sort of homage to the rhythm and movement set, but these were made by E4.
You're watching E4. This is E4. This is E4.
Amusingly tongue-in-cheek, wouldn't you say? E4 is a channel that launched back in 2001, so we're still relatively new and fresh on the scene when these parodies were made, not long after the originals launched on BBC One in 2002. The three different parodies we get are based on Capoeira, Ballet, and Acrobat, fittingly three of the earliest idents that debuted as part of the rhythm and movement package. They are obvious in what they're representing, but not disrespectful. The Capoeira and Ballet parodies are super short in length, but they too quickly generate some comedy. In the former's case, we see the martial artists beat each other up, and the one member of the ballet troupe who absolutely kills me off is the one on the floor just bouncing along. It's absolutely daft for sure, but you gotta admit it's funny. It's poking fun at the often controlled, very elegant style that ballet showcases, and it's all for a bit of fun, isn't it? For the Acrobat parody, which is a bit more full length, we see the three drop from the roof as in the original, the material's now purple instead of red. The setting has been altered to more of a dingy warehouse with an open roof, and rather than gracefully showcase a series of moves, we see that the artists are having a little trouble in their execution. All in all, they're daft for sure, but feels typical of the kind of slant E4 was going for in its early years, poking fun at something that millions of viewers would be used to seeing every day over on BBC One. But now we move to the BBC themselves, and one of their staples in terms of comedy, the duo known as French and Saunders. Well, these are different, aren't they? By the early 2000s, French and Saunders were already well-established household names amongst the British public. As part of their shows, they paid homage to idents from the rhythm and movement set, the ever-popular Acrobat, and also hip-hop, with a little bit of the Salsa sequence for good measure. The first one sees the two accompany one of the artists from the original ident, only for them to awkwardly drop to the floor, hitting it like a ton of bricks. Unfazed, they quickly get up and head towards the camera, the title for their show appearing also. This is typical of the kind of comedy you would find in French and Saunders, a nice blend of awkward physical comedy with the unassuming looks of the leads, and it works a treat. During the closing credits of an episode, they decide to show their take on the hip-hop ident, or not so hip-hop, as it's come to be known. We see them driving around on mobility scooters in a rather uncool way, a complete contrast to the original, and it's interesting that the location used here is the one seen in the Salsa ident rather than the basketball court in hip-hop, but I still think it works just fine. Overall, the French and Saunders spoofs aren't necessarily the greatest ident parodies ever, but they succeed in combining the charm of their show into the familiar landscape of the rhythm and movement set. Now to another comedy legend, let's see how Peter Kay took on hip-hop under the guise of one of his trademark characters, Brian Potter.
Whoa, 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 I can't do that, I can't do that. No chance, these lads are clearly blessed. Hey, not dodging, son, not dodging. Whoa, whoa. That's that. Oh, Dave. Oh, help me! Help me!
You can't help but smile at Peter Kay, can you? Similar to French and Saunders, Peter Kay was a popular comedian, at the time riding high on his television show, Phoenix Nights. For the comic relief telethon of 2003, one of his characters, Brian Potter, would help introduce the night's events. By joining the athletes on the basketball court, he fumbles around, unable to pull off the moves as they do, and responding in typical fashion. It's quite simple again, but for me the dialogue works a treat. Peter Kay's delivery always manages to get a chuckle out of me. The second variant I find even funnier, where poor Potter once again tries to copy those surrounding him, only to topple out of his chair entirely. Physical comedy executed wonderfully, and my only criticism would be to say that it's a shame that more spoofs of other idents from this era weren't commissioned. There are a few more parody sequences from this era, but unfortunately I wasn't able to find video for all of them. In the comedy radio and television programme, Dead Ringers, one episode showcased John Culshaw, as the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, performing a dance outside of 10 Downing Street, as if it were a BBC One ident. This was seen in an episode that aired in the summer of 2003 over on BBC Two. Meanwhile, over at the recently launched BBC Three, parodies would be seen on the adult comedy animation series Monkey Dust. I could only find one short clip, but unfortunately, I'm not going to risk showing it to you here. If you have a browse, you'll know what I mean, as many of Monkey Dust's parodies contained elements that aren't necessarily suitable for younger audiences. But then again, you could argue that BBC Three in its early days as a whole wasn't suitable for younger audiences. Whether you love them or hate them, I believe parodies are always a fun and interesting side note in a channel's history. Being able to open up and poke fun at yourself, or to let others do so, often yields great results, without necessarily being hurtful or disrespectful. Whether it's French and Saunders, Peter Kay, or even rival channels like E4, these parodies, if anything, are a testament to the originals from the rhythm and movement set, showing that because the originals offered something interesting and inspiring, these parodies in a roundabout way pay homage to that individuality, and often can be pretty amusing and memorable in their own unique way. Overall, the rhythm and movement idents continue to garner a mixed reception, over 20 years since their initial debut on BBC One. However, what I'll always commend this set for is for trying something which at the time was radically different for the corporation's oldest channel. Instead of globes and symbols, we're presented with real people, of different ages, genders, races, cultures, abilities, skills, and so on. Across all of the sequences we've seen in the marathon, we've certainly had our variety in terms of the people showcased, and the different kinds of central concepts with them. Not every ident was a winner, it's very difficult for any setup to achieve that status, but in the 4.5 years that Rhythm and Movement represented BBC One, despite a rocky reception, they arguably reflected that the channel, and the BBC as a whole, was attempting to represent as many people as possible in a variety of unique, different and entertaining ways. The legacy of Rhythm and Movement has clearly had its impact on the channel too, with the Oneness Idents, introduced en masse in 2017, sharing some similarities with its predecessor. Even the current lens set, making its debut in 2022, incorporates the element of real people doing a variety of different things. They may be overwhelmingly forgettable, or they may even be amongst your favourite idents of all time, but regardless of where you stand, the Rhythm and Movement idents marked a new turn for BBC One, attempting to fully bring them into the 21st century and to present themselves in an engaging, individual, and memorable way. Here's to this set, the people involved in its creation, and to the stars of the sequences themselves, for their work has provided millions with comfort, intrigue, and joy, for 20 years, and certainly many more years to follow. And so that brings us to the end of another marathon here on the Ident Review Extra. If you enjoyed our look back at the Rhythm and Movement idents of BBC One, then please leave a like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to the channel for lots more ident related content. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.
So there you go, a selection of the symbols which have defined BBC One for the last 4.5 years. A new look comes round from 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, but in the meantime, just before we hand over to BBC News 24, there's time for one last dance.
Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Bruce Danton, The Broken Kitsumanoid, and Francine Salazar, our AMTV staff members.